And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Bernard Powers, who served on the steering committee, who is on the faculty of the History Department of the College of Charleston, a well-recognized scholar in his own right of American and African American history, and who is committed to public history, to taking history beyond the classroom and taking it out into the public realm by working with museums. And it's been a pleasure for us at Drayton Hall to work with Dr. Powers, who is also the Associate Chairman of the History Department at the College of Charleston. He's written a wonderful book entitled Black Charlestonians. Dr. Powers. And can you hear us at the back? We had a little dip in the sound. You okay? Just be sure to speak into it. Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. And George, as usual, thank you for your generosity and for your gracious introduction. Of course, you know, on these occasions, I'm always a little intimidated, but especially so this morning, following a national treasure, as I have to do now. But
Charleston treasure, those who would argue that's equivalent.
That's right. That's right. Thank you very much. Let me remind you of the significance of the cemetery in the African American experience. We find evidence of the importance of this place in historical literature, slave narratives, and folklore. And I just call to your attention now the narrative of the North Carolina slave Harriet Jacobs, whose narrative is entitled Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, to illustrate the significance of these sacred places. She would make a decision to run away, and on the eve of embarking on her effort to obtain freedom, she went out into the graveyard where her parents were buried. And she went specifically to the father's grave site, and this is what she says. That site was marked by a small wooden board bearing his name, the letters of which were nearly obliterated. I knelt down and kissed them and poured forth a prayer to God for guidance and support in the perilous step I was about to take. As I passed the wreck of the old meeting house where before Nat Turner's time the slaves had been allowed to meet and worship, I seemed to hear my father's voice come from it, bidding me not to tarry till I reached freedom or the grave. I rushed on with renovated hopes. My trust in God had been strengthened by the prayer among those graves. So the cemetery has always been a place of power, a place worthy of respect, and of course a place of ultimate destiny. And we're on the edge of such a place today. And our purpose is to celebrate these new installations and the lives that they memorialize. Today's event is just the most recent effort to give proper attention to African American life at Drayton Hall, and really continues the September 2008 program held here to commemorate the life and legacy of Mr. Richmond Bowens. Now, this cemetery may have been used as early as 1790, and it was certainly used in the late 19th century. Approximately 40 graves have been discovered or identified at the site, but we believe that there are considerably more than that number in the area. The last person to be interred there was Richmond Bowens in 1998, and his biography and heritage have been unique and of incomparable value to Drayton Hall, as he is descended from a family that came from Barbados with the Draytons in Carolina's earliest days. Richmond Bowens was born here in 1908, and he grew up working for the Drayton family. and eventually will become the first gatekeeper here at Drayton Hall. And he would provide an important and really incomparable perspective on African American life here, particularly during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, the decision to undertake this cemetery memorial project was a result of several converging factors. First, this effort naturally derived from Drayton Hall's role as a national leader in the interpretation of the African American experience at plantation sites. And the project readily won the support of the Drayton Hall Advisory Board and also of the National Trust Office. But secondly, the cemetery is situated on a 10-acre plot. And as you can see, this is a forested area that is interspersed with trees and shrubs. And according to Richmond Bowens, the cemetery had always looked in this way. And one of his wishes was that it be left in a natural state. And when asked about care for the area, referring to those interred there, he now famously said, simply, leave them rest. And so based on Richmond Bowens' recollections and his final wishes for the site, no effort has been made to formalize the cemetery with landscaping or to restore it to a particular time period. However, remaining true to the historical record posed its own challenges for the staff here at Drayton Hall. While a sign on the main road and a cross in the trees marked the cemetery, visitors who stopped at the site frequently failed to understand its historical and cultural context, even though a brochure was provided at the site. Many visitors, of course, failed to actually read the brochure, but even some who read it still left the site believing that the cemetery was simply neglected. And also, Bowen's family members in particular requested that greater attention be drawn to their family members' contributions to the plantation. Drayton Hall employed a consultant to examine the status of African Americans here in the overall interpretation of the site, and one of the recommendations that was brought forth was that the African American cemetery be more formally integrated into the routine interpretation of the plantation site. And so, based on the foregoing, a chain of events was initiated that has brought us here today. Now, to frame the essential issues surrounding the cemetery, in either late 2007 or early 2008, Dr. George McDaniel and staff convened the African American Memorial Steering Committee, which consisted of Drayton Hall staff, community representatives, scholars, Philip Simmons Foundation representatives, as well as Bowens and Drayton family members. And periodically, other interested parties participated in the meetings. An overriding goal of this project has been to honor and respect the past, to ensure that the African American story is not marginalized at Drayton Hall, and further to connect or build bridges with current and future generations of visitors and of descendants, both African American and white. And one of the first decisions that the committee made was to reaffirm Richmond Bowens' recollections and insights about the cemetery, and these were used as a central premise. No ornamental plantings or formal pathways would be installed in the cemetery, but it would remain a naturalized zone that blends seamlessly into the adjacent forest. This would provide an important contrast with the rest of the much more formalized grounds. The steering committee desired that wherever possible, African and African American themes be incorporated into the design of the project, and this decision informed many of the other decisions. As a central part of the cemetery memorial, in its early meetings, the committee proposed an iron structure to frame the entrance to the cemetery, formed by a natural break in the trees. Particularly important, though, was the exact form the structure should take. Should it be a gate or should it be an arch? And after some discussion, it was decided that an arch would be most consonant with traditional African and African American notions of spirituality, whereas a gate suggested hard and fast borders, an archway conveyed the idea of permeability and the easy relationship that existed between the material and the spiritual, the living and the dead, in traditional African ideas about cosmology and the metaphysical world. In January 2008, the late Philip Simmons, the renowned Charleston blacksmith, was consulted about the design and fabrication of the arch. Simmons was chosen because, of course, of his reputation and because he had important connections to black families here at Drayton Hall. He and Richmond Bowens were great friends and frequently socialized together. And Philip Simmons contributed important ideas about the form and content for the arch, but because of his age and failing health, Joseph Ronnie Pringle, one of his cousins and a longtime Simmons apprentice, took charge of the final design and fabrication process. And after months of meetings to discuss the particular design features, the steering committee arrived at a plan for an archway that contained symbolic and literal elements. And so when you go over, you will see that within each of the vertical supports on either side of the arch and extending upwards from the ground, there's a series of interlocking rings and bars, crossbars, which symbolize the chains of slavery. However, those elements end at the base of the curved archway to symbolize the end to the institution of slavery and the end to life on this earth. Philip Simmons suggested that a bird be placed within the final circle on each side to symbolize freedom, movement, and transition to a new life. This imagery is, of course, also reminiscent of the folklore about flying Africans who managed to return to the African continent. And the very apex of the archway has a central place, and within its metallic borders are Richmond Bowens' words, "Leave rest." And a cross rests above these words atop the center of the arch. The public and family members had a chance to respond to the cemetery plans, and the results were overwhelmingly positive. And the final plans for the cemetery were approved by the Office of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and here we are today. The Bowens family is a central story here at Drayton Hall, and the cemetery will help us to further tell that story. But as one looks around today in this area, one sees a cemetery, but in the late 19th century and early 20th century, there were at least 14 houses on 3 sides of the cemetery. It was indeed a small neighborhood, and those who lived here worked for the Draytons in their home or as tenant farmers. Others worked in the phosphate mining industry, a new industry that developed shortly after the Civil War. And the extraordinary life of Philip Simmons, who acquired his ironworking skills from a line of slave and former slave blacksmiths, allow one to explore historical skills at Drayton Hall and their transmission from the antebellum period even into the 20th century. The cemetery can be used to appreciate the spiritual values of African and African American people. For example, we know that ancient African traditions, such as gravesite decoration, continued to be practiced in this cemetery even into the early 20th century. For example, when Richmond Bowens Sr. passed away in 1920, his barber clippers and mustache cut were among the items placed atop his grave. This practice was common in the cemetery. This sacred space is indeed a special place which reflects the complexity of race relations in America and demonstrates the compelling force of place in the South. Remember, Richmond Bowens returned here worked here after his return and is buried here. And some Bowen's relatives who passed away in the North also have come home and are buried here. Other Bowen's relatives expressed their profound sense of connection with their departed ancestors on the property when they visit. One of the most important aspects of the Drayton Hall African American Cemetery Memorial Project is the collaborative effort that has been responsible for its success. Representatives of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Drayton Hall staff, scholars, family, and community members have all made essential contributions. Also important to this story is that it reveals white members of the Drayton family and black descendants of the Bowens family who shared the entwined destiny of enslavement and mastery, yet are able to cooperate together in a way that reflects important truths about both. This is a story that began as one about the deceased and our memories of them. But it has much more to tell about the biographies of the living, our own psyches, and individual and family needs in the present. So let the stories be told. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Dr. Powell. Wonderful presentation, and also the biographies of the living and telling the story. Again, just that point is being accented throughout.